PRISM when you want more.
There was a time not too long ago when 80,000 people would jam Franklin Field here to watch the University of Pennsylvania play football. There have been other times when you'd be hard-pressed to get 8,000 people here, even if you gave the tickets away. University of Pennsylvania football, quite a tradition, one with a lot of ups and downs, and it's the subject of this edition of Sports Scrapbook. To capture the tradition of Pennsylvania football, we'll visit with former red and blue greats like Chuck Bednarik and Reds Bagnell, as well as prominent alumnus Bob Levy, administrators like former athletic director Fred Schabel and current AD Charles Harris, along with Jerry Byrne, the coach who is breathing new life into today's program. With me is Dan Rottenberg, a one-time, third or fourth string football player here at Pennsylvania who has authored the book Fight On Pennsylvania, which is the history and tradition of University of Pennsylvania football. And Dan, what prompted this venture?
Well, I was both a football player at Penn, Jim, and also sports editor of the Daily Pennsylvanian, and I've been going to Penn football games since I was about 10 years old. My father played in the band here, so it's just something that I've always been steeped in. And 8 years ago, when the university had its 100th anniversary of football, they asked me if I would write a book on Penn football. The book never came out at that time for a variety of reasons, but now that Penn has a good football team again, we found a publisher, and the book is coming out now, updated to the present. It's just off the presses this month.
You mentioned Penn's good football team. Now, there was a time when it was a great football team, and a time when Franklin Field was the happening in all of Philadelphia. And we're talking about post-World War II, or actually late 30s right on to late 40s. What was going on here?
Well, Penn has had several periods, actually going back to the 1890s, when it was one of the best teams in the country. In 1931, there was an about-face, and the university totally de-emphasized football for the first time, put football under academic authorities. Up until that time, it was run by the alumni, totally independent of the university. And for several years there in the 30s, there were really very weak teams. The coaches were very poorly paid. They were paid like professors, maybe $7,500 a year, and it was very tough to get anybody to coach a team for that money. 1938, they got a coach named George Munger, who almost single-handedly turned the program around just by the force of his personality. He was a remarkable fellow, and basically an educator rather than a jock, and he treated his players not like children but like adults. And of course it happened that this was the ideal approach to football after World War II, after 1945, when you had lots of ex-GIs, people like Chuck Bednarik, who had flown combat missions over Germany, and then they come back, they get out of the army, they come to college, they're already in their early 20s, they've already seen death in Europe or in Asia, and they want to play football, but they don't want to be treated like kids. And George Munger was just the ideal kind of person to play for, and the word just sort of got around in GI circles and in other circles that this is the place to go. And almost by himself, Munger was able to attract a nucleus of players that were good enough to get Penn consistently rated in the late 40s, one of the very top teams in the East, and usually very often among the top 10 or 20 in the nation.
How about the impact that Penn football had on the community, the university? I mean, there were 80,000 people here on some Saturdays.
Sure. It's hard, maybe hard for people to understand it now, but In those days, Penn football was the equivalent in Philadelphia of what the Eagles are today, and maybe even more so. Whether you went to Penn or not, you came to the Penn football game on Saturday just the way Eagles fans go to the Vet today. On Sunday, the lead story in the newspapers was Penn football, not only in Philadelphia, but in the New York Times. It was the major sports attraction in Philadelphia then.
In those days, Columbia was good with Gene Rossides and so forth. They knocked off Army's 26-game winning streak. The Princetons were pretty good. Cornell had good clubs. There was no formal Ivy League team, so they all played a good schedule. Of course, we played the Army and the Navy, and you talk about the weekends there, the atmosphere around the school, the women with their big carnations, 78,000 people, the midshipmen marching in there, the cadets marching in there. Oh, it was super great. It was super great. Of course, we were ranked nationally, so it was big-time football with a great college.
Fantastic. It was just a way of life for Philadelphians and Pennsylvania people and the surrounding area. It was a social event as well as a highly competitive football game.
What was going on in the university, though? Were they making tons of money and relishing in this kind of attention?
Well, the university at that time, I think it would be fair to say, as an academic institution, had really slipped back, I would say, between the First World War and thereafter. It was not considered a major quality institution at that time. And after World War II, the university was in serious financial situation also. In 1948, Harold Stassen, who had been governor of Minnesota and was a perennial candidate for president of the U.S., became president of the university, and his biggest problem was, how do you solve the university's financial crises? And Stassen decided the way to do it is to take advantage of this football team we have, and let's, if it is such a good football team, instead of just playing Eastern schools, let's start to play a national powerhouse kind of schedule. And he started scheduling teams like Notre Dame and Ohio State, California, Michigan, Army, Navy.
Very few Ivy League opponents.
That's right. That's right. And of course, the ironic thing is that it was just at this time that the Ivy League, as we know it now, was coming to be organized. The presidents of the Ivy schools were meeting, and they were saying things like, well, we ought to cut out athletic scholarships, we ought to cut out spring training. And Penn, Stassen was going to these meetings and saying, yes, that's a good idea, at the same time that he was making plans to schedule Notre Dame and schools like that.
The most exciting games to play were, I would say, were Army and Navy, because they would bring the Corps cadets and the midshipmen would march in and participate, and that was always a full house. And Army was always in the top 5 in the country anyway under Earl Blake at that particular time when we would meet them late in the season. So our games are always the #1 game of the week, and most people don't realize it, but all of Pennsylvania's games were televised in those days. And I can legitimately say they were televised nationally, but not in the same view as today. When you televise a game nationally, it goes everywhere. In those days, they didn't have the affiliations that exist today in various stations, so we did have national television, but it was, East Coast and that type.
Notre Dame used to come in?
Notre Dame would come in, Ohio State would come in, California would come in, Wisconsin was leading the Big Ten in my senior year, and we did a pretty good number on them when they came in here.
Was Penn a football factory at that time? Were the guys who were out there playing jocks, or were they students as well?
They were certainly students, but it's interesting when you look back at the clips from those days, there were so many pictures in the newspapers of Penn football players working at their studies, and that, it's like Shakespeare said, methinks the lady doth protest too much. I wondered if you had to take all these pictures of how diligently they were studying, wasn't there something wrong? Back in the 20s, when Franklin Field was built, I would say there was a lot of football corruption, not only at Penn, but at just about every other college, because they were building these huge stadiums, and they had to find a way to pay for them. And to get people into the stadiums, they would bring in football players in who very often had really very little qualification to be students at all, and some of them weren't even students. And that was true at Penn as at other schools. But in the 40s, I don't really think that was true. I think you had people coming who wanted to go to college, and they wanted to play football for George Munger.
I certainly don't perceive it as a football factory. I know that in my own, and I can only speak as an individual, I didn't know what the requirement the other kids were. What their boards were, or their aptitude tests, I think it was in those days. But in my case, I had 1 year of Latin and 1 year of Spanish when I left West Catholic. And in order to enter Pennsylvania after taking the aptitude tests, I had to fulfill the requirement of having 2 years of one language. So then I matriculated at North Germantown Academy and stayed up there for a year and got a year of Latin and a year of Spanish and took some geology and a very good English course. And so the extra year was very, very beneficial to me in spite of the fact that I needed it to get into Pennsylvania.
I think the rug kind of slowly got pulled out from under them, didn't it? I mean, the big names were still on the schedule, and yet the backroom caucus was de-emphasis.
That's exactly right. In 1952, the NCAA rules were changed to enable the teams to go to 2 platooning. But to make that change, you really needed spring practice, especially if you were playing all the other schools that had spring practice. And in 1953, Penn faced what I think is probably one of the most powerful schedules faced by any team anywhere. And they did it without the benefit of spring practice, and they did it without athletic scholarships. And they still managed to win 3 games and lose 5 and tie 1. They almost beat Ohio State. They almost beat Notre Dame. I think it's one of the most remarkable teams in Penn history, even though it was Munger's first losing season ever, and even though he quit as coach after that. The following 2 years, 1954 and 55, Penn faced the same schedule with the same restrictions, and they didn't win a game all season. They went 19 straight games. They lost, and I think 22 straight games without a win.
Well, Penn was really riding very high as far as national attention and the kind of program that it had. To join the Ivy League group with their new rules and regulations, I think Penn probably had the most to lose as far as its football program. By virtue of joining the academic rules and regulations of the Ivy League group, Penn struggled to maintain the level that it had, and not only struggled to maintain the old level, which was impossible, but I think Penn probably had an inferiority complex, and they maybe wasn't as aggressive and as enthusiastic towards trying to put their program together as they should have been.
What do you think alumni were feeling back then when they have seen, the great program, and all of a sudden they saw what was an abysmal program?
Sure. Well, what
was happening there? They tearing the place down?
I was only, of course, 12 years old at that time. I can't speak for the alumni, but I think quite obviously they felt that this is horrible, that Penn, here we had this fantastic football team and we're just giving it up completely.
Well, see, the Ivy League agreement was great until they started to keep score. And when they keep score, somebody had to be last. And we were always finding ourselves in last place, and of course that doesn't sit well with any alumnus, because at the cocktail party and the business meetings, everybody wants to talk about football, and Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, and Cornell were coming out on top, and we were at the bottom. And I think the Ivy League agreement was great in theory, and it made everybody equal, but of course they do keep score and they do keep standings.
Well, what happened was that Penn football got pretty bad, and even by Ivy League rules, couldn't even compete.
Well,
why did it get so bad?
Basically what happened, the Ivy League agreement was signed in 1953, but the football schedules are set up 2 or 3 years in advance. So the formal Ivy League schedule didn't start till 1956. So Penn had those 2 disastrous years where they didn't win a game. But even after that, we won the Ivy League in 1959, but aside from that, I think there was 2 winning seasons in about 18, 19 years after the Ivy League started, and that's not a very good record. Basically what happened was, when the Ivy League was first formed, Penn was seen as the fox in the chicken coop. All the other Ivy League schools didn't even want to let Penn in because we were so much stronger, had so much better team, and they kind of didn't trust that Penn would follow the rules. And it was only because the athletic director at Penn at the time, Jeremiah Ford, gave his personal pledge that Penn would obey the rules of the Ivy League that Penn was even allowed in the Ivy League at all. So you had this ironic situation where Jeremiah Ford became personally responsible for seeing that Penn stayed to the straight and narrow, and Penn wound up being the most Simon Pure observer of the Ivy principles. And all the other schools, I think, were bending the rules here and there on practices, on recruiting, on whatever. Penn was following the rules to the letter, and as a result, consistently coming in the second division.
Looking back at the 50s was that when Penn joined the Ivy League group, they were very strict in their interpretations of the philosophical base that was established. Maybe they weren't aggressive enough, maybe they weren't enthusiastic enough, maybe they didn't bring the components together that add up to victory. The admissions office, the budget office, the need for capital projects. So I think possibly we were much more philosophical without the enthusiastic and aggressive approach in the early 50s.
There's several players at Pennsylvania that received some recognition on a national basis. From 54 earlier, a lot of them. I was one of them. And I do still get around and I play golf and see a lot of people. And it was very difficult when they knew that I had made All-American, I'd gotten a Maxwell Award, and then recently I got inducted into the Hall of Fame, to tell them I was from the University of Pennsylvania in the Ivy League. They'd look at you like, and they didn't know about the 50s, the early 50s, the 40s, and the 30s. They didn't know about that at Pennsylvania. And it was really difficult to be proud of being a good athlete and be proud of being a successful graduate of the University of Pennsylvania when we were rolling around in the bottom of the Ivy League, and not only in football, but our overall program. Maybe basketball would be an exception in several periods of time during the last 30 years where basketball was an exception. Football had one exception in 1958-9 period when they won the Ivy League. But it was very difficult. It was embarrassing to have to identify yourself with a program that was geared to lose. And who wants to lose?
We got to see a kind of a succession of coaches here. George Munger was here a long time, and all of a sudden in the next maybe 2 decades, coaches are coming and going pretty quickly, and we'll mention some names. Steve Sebo, and then John Stigman, Bob Odell, Harry Gamble. None of them able to really turn things around consistently. And is that an administration problem, or is that maybe their own problem, or a combination?
Well, I would say there was a combination. I think most of those coaches did labor under some definite disadvantages in that Penn did not have the resources available, and they didn't have the recruiting network that a lot of that Harvard and Yale have, let's say. And part of the reason was because a lot of the alumni were just so turned off by the way the program had been completely de-emphasized. So it was a very difficult period, I think. And in many respects, it's amazing that Penn did as well as it did. I mean, we did win the Ivy League title in 1959. Harry Gamble was here for 10 years in the 70s and actually did produce 4 winning seasons. But for a long period there, the alumni were simply turned off and would not cooperate, or had no real incentive to try to go out and get really good players.
Dan, we've had back-to-back Ivy League championships now for Penn football, and there seems to be some consistency toward winning again, and a commitment, I guess, is the word. What's been happening?
Well, I would say, Jim, you get a combination of people and you get the right kind of chemistry, and it just changes everything. I mean, we have a new president of the university now, Sheldon Hackney, who is much more interested in football, and I think just that the fact that he says something and sends a message out to lots of other people. His 2 predecessors, Gaylord Harnwell and Martin Meyerson, came to football games mainly because they had to, and they usually left at the half. Hackney actually likes to go to football games. He actually cares about whether there's a winning football team or not. He likes to go into the locker room afterward and congratulate the players. So that sends a message down to everybody else in the administration and everybody else in the alumni. We have a new athletic director, Charles Harris, who of course came here from University of Michigan, which is a much bigger kind of program. Most important, I think, we have a new coach, Jerry Berndt, who I think has single-handedly just turned the program around and given a message to players and shown that they can win. And these things sort of feed on themselves, and I think, at least I hope they will continue to.
Well, first of all, we needed a real commitment out of various people, and this commitment had to start from the top, and that top person obviously is the president of the university. And Sheldon Hackney, prior to my accepting the position, made a very pointed statement about wanting our football program to be the best in the Ivy League and to win the Ivy League championship every year, Jim. So I don't think that you can run a successful program without that kind of commitment from that individual. In turn, my immediate boss, Charles Harris, has made a firm commitment to support our football program, and that's very, very important. And then the next thing, our alumni, we have a constituency of alums out there that are really wanted to see winning football return to the University of Pennsylvania. For one reason or another, we were kind of in the doldrums and in a slump as far as being competitive on the football field, and we just needed to return some of that tradition that we had back in the George Munger era, and that we had in the 59 team, and that we had in the late 60s when it looked like we got it going again, and in the early 70s. And we've had our spurts, but we've just not been able to maintain it during modern football history here at Penn. So these, without the support of our alumni, we could not be successful either. So I think it started with the commitment and support by those people.
The administration had changed. The basic question was, what's the philosophy? What do we want to accomplish? We're in the Ivy League. Are we going to be satisfied just to be in it, or do we want to be successful? And I think a lot of things had just broken down over time because there had been so many administrative changes. What my theory was, I think we needed to work from the inside out, and we started with things like training facilities, Franklin Field itself, a new turf. Then we started to look around, and I've placed a substantial premium on quality people. I've always felt if you got good people and you give them good support, one thing will kind of lead to another over time.
Can you measure what a successful football program, despite whatever level, can do for a campus?
Well, that's the fascinating thing, Jim. I think if you actually, in strictly rational terms, try to examine it, what is it? It's a bunch of people kicking a ball around on a field. It has no intrinsic value whatever, and yet in emotional and symbolic terms, there's nothing that can quite symbolize what's going on at a university. Nothing that can quite bring all the people, all the elements of a university together than a football game can. I mean, it's not just a sporting event. It is a major social event. It is a major opportunity for everybody connected with the university to gather in one place and express their loyalty. And obviously, if you have a good football team, the students are going to feel better about themselves. Especially the alumni are going to feel better about themselves, because that's really all that they are getting out of the university once they graduate, is the fun of going to a sports event. And these things kind of feed on themselves. So sure, there is a great deal that a good football team can do.
Jerry Burnt seems to be a real breath of fresh air. His enthusiasm has to rub off on everything and everybody, and I guess Penn would really hate to lose him.
Well, I think that's certainly true. He's made a tremendous difference, and I think it's partly because he has this wonderful small-town Midwest background where he really naively believes in all of the American virtues that most city people are very cynical about. But he comes in and he believes them so firmly, he gets everybody else to believe in them too.
When we got into the decision to make a coaching change, it was at a point that I think many of the other things we'd resolved. We'd made some commitments to the program. We knew that we wanted to be as successful as we possibly could. And in looking for Jerry, what I was looking for was a first-class individual. I took the premise that anybody who's been in the coaching business for 20 years, the fact that they're still around says they know how to coach. I wanted integrity. I wanted somebody who had the ability to attract good people, both from a staffing standpoint and the ability to work with all levels of people from a recruiting standpoint. And what you're looking for is an ambassador, somebody who can come in and organize and get the job done. There is no better coach than Jerry Burnt.
He's got the alumni busting their chests out again, and I wonder if they're not going to get itchy now and say, hey, since we can compete very well now at the Ivy League level, maybe we can take that extra little step and knock off an Army or a Navy here and there, or take on some other, not one of the majors, but step up a little bit.
Well, this has happened before in Penn history, and in fact, the late 40s, Harold Stassen got exactly this idea, which is what I mentioned before, and it was a disaster for Penn, and I think it would probably be a disaster again for different reasons. Nowadays, you're competing with professional sports, particularly in a city like Philadelphia, and there's just no way you can do it without really sacrificing the quality of the university, I would say. So maybe it might be fun once a year to have a game against Penn State or something like that, just for the heck of it. But to try to really step up to the level of, let's say, an Oklahoma or an Ohio State, something like that, is going to require tremendous sacrifices, and I don't just mean in terms of money, I mean in terms of the quality of the school.
I'm happy with that because, one, what we are embarking upon, we're being successful at, and that is participation in the Ivy League. My personal feelings is I would like an extension of that. I would like to, we are going to play Army this year. Hopefully we'll play Navy next year. And frankly, I'd like to play an intersectional game with somebody. To do that, we can't continue under the aid program or lack of aid program that we have for the kids that come in here and play football. They come into the university first and they play football next. And it's a burden for a young man to come to Pennsylvania, even to come to go to school to play football.
We have Lehigh on the schedule. We have Navy on the schedule. And, you know, looking through the mid-90s as we're scheduled out to now, I don't see anybody on that schedule that I don't think we can be competitive with. It's important to say, Jim, we want to win. I mean, there's no question about it. But that's different from saying winning means everything. We're going to put on a first-class operation here. We're going to have a first-class program. And if out of that we can attract the kind of people and staff and fans who are willing to support us, we're not going to win every game, but we're going to sure go out with that intention.
One gets the feeling that football is real fun around here again. Everyone seems to be happy. Faculty, students, even the hard-to-please alumni. But still, I think there's that little tug where everybody is saying, let's beat Army one more time.